She sued me for $50,000, not for the color of my fence, but for daring to build on land she insisted was her sacred ancestral birthright. The Homeowners Association, the so-called HOA, was just her chosen weapon to get it done. Every time I close my eyes, I see her, a slender woman with a helmet of blonde hair, cold ice-blue eyes, and thin lips permanently set in a line of judgment. At first, I thought it was just another petty neighbor dispute, a ridiculous power play by someone with too much time on her hands. But then the threats became real, and the absurd fines started showing up at my door. She wanted control over a property that wasn't hers. But what she didn't realize is that I spent my entire career learning exactly how to fight these legal battles, permanently and decisively. My name is Alex. At 35, with a tall, lean build and a head of dark brown hair, that's always a bit unruly. I did what most people only dream of. I retired early. After more than a decade at City Hall, specializing in zoning issues and property law, I'd saved enough to escape the corporate grind. All I wanted was peace, a place where I dressed in my work uniform of jeans and an old t-shirt could renovate. The old house I'd just bought with only my loyal golden retriever, Max, for company. The house was a charmingly stubborn relic, with faded siding and a porch that creaked under Max's weight. But to me, it was a passion project. I thought I'd escaped the madness of property disputes. Turns out I just parked right next to its queen. The first time I saw Caroline Vance, she was a stark contrast to the idyllic surroundings. She stood, her back ramrod straight, in an ivory-colored linen suit, her frame as thin as a bird's. Her blonde hair was so perfectly styled that no breeze could dare displace it, looking hard and glossy in the sun. She held a laser measuring device, and her high-pitched, clipped voice rang out, screaming at a teenager for parking 2 inches over a curb line. She was the president of the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association, and she ran it like a miniature dictatorship. She lived in the biggest house in the neighborhood, right at the corner where her property line almost touched mine. Almost being the key word there. My house, blessedly, sat entirely outside the HOA's legal boundaries. I had triple-checked that before signing, however, to get to my house, the only and shortest route was a small road that cut through their neighborhood. It was simply the most logical path. But apparently that simple fact was about to become the center of a nightmare. The conflict didn't start with a bang, but with a series of passive-aggressive emails. A week after I moved in, I received one from Caroline. She kindly informed me that the royal blue paint on my front door wasn't on the approved palette. Ran a hand through my messy hair, sighed, and replied, just as politely, reminding her that my property wasn't under her jurisdiction. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. The next week, it was about my hummingbird feeder, then my wind chimes, which, according to her, created harmonic dissonance. Each email was written in this ridiculously formal language, citing HOA bylaws that had absolutely no application to me. The real confrontation happened on a Thursday afternoon. I was on a ladder in an old flannel shirt, trimming a few branches on my old oak tree. Suddenly, I heard that sharp voice. "It's Mr. Alex, I'm going to need you to stop that immediately." I turned to see Caroline Vance marching across the lawn, her back as straight as a flagpole. Scurrying behind her was a small, mousy woman with brown hair and a ponytail, who I'd later learn was named Brenda. She clutched a clipboard to her chest like a shield. Caroline's ice-blue eyes glared at my tree. "That oak is in violation of community regulations regarding height and canopy spread. Your branches are encroaching on our airspace." I almost laughed. But I kept my composure. In my calm, clear voice, I replied, "Your airspace? Caroline, this is my property, and not a single branch is crossing the property line." Her thin lips pressed into an even tighter line. "Our rules apply not just to property lines, but to the aesthetic harmony. Your unauthorized improvements are bringing down the value of the entire neighborhood." "Your rules don't apply to me," I said, my patient tone holding steady. "I bought this place precisely because it was outside that madness." She gave me a sharp glare, the large brooch on her shoulder flashing in the sun, then spun on her heel. and marched back to her house, Brenda hurrying to keep up. I just stood there on my ladder, watching her rigid back retreat. She had just marched onto land she had no claim to, and that would be her first mistake. 3 days later, as I was mowing my front lawn, a police cruiser pulled up. The officer got out and asked me about complaints regarding the willful projection of lawn debris onto a public thoroughfare. I actually had to laugh out loud. "Officer," I said, "I'm mowing my lawn." The cop looked tired. "Look, man, we get a call. We'll have to check it out." As the cruiser drove away, I saw a flicker of movement behind the curtains of Caroline's house. I could feel her sharp eyes watching. She was using city resources to harass me. The game had escalated. And I knew with someone like Caroline, this was only the warm-up act. I thought the police call was the peak of absurdity, but I was wrong. It was merely the opening shot in a systematic campaign of harassment designed to wear down my spirit and invade my privacy. Caroline Vance didn't want a confrontation. Wanted a war of attrition, and my home was the battlefield. A few days after the incident with the cop, I came home from a hardware run to find a bright red notice plastered to my front door. It was designed to look like an official legal document, with the words "Final Notice of Violation" printed in a bold, intimidating font. In ridiculously bureaucratic language, it listed a new series of infractions. My mailbox, the same rusted, the box that had stood there for a decade, was now non-compliant with community standards. Debt. The way I stacked my firewood on the side of the house was deemed aesthetically displeasing and a potential fire hazard. Even a minor crack in my concrete walkway was cited as evidence of gross property neglect. Each item cited some article from the HOA bylaws. I stood there reading the notice while Max sniffed at it, and I didn't know whether to laugh or rage. This was no longer obsession. This was deliberate fabrication. Then came the phone calls. They arrived at the oddest hours. 7 a.m. on a Sunday, as I was nursing my first cup of coffee, the phone would ring. Caroline's clipped voice would come on the line without a greeting. "Your dog's barking is disturbing residents who wish to rest." Another time, at 10 p.m., she called to complain that leaves from my oak tree were falling onto their road and creating a slippage hazard. The height of the ridiculous was a call on a Tuesday afternoon. "Do I need to fine you for allergies?" she demanded. I was completely lost. "Excuse me?" "Your dog just sneezed," she said, her voice entirely serious, very loudly. It startled the birds in my yard. I hung up the phone, my disbelief turning into a cold dread. She was watching me. Every little detail. That feeling was confirmed a few days later. I was in the backyard, trying to mend a section of the old fence, when I caught a flicker of movement across the street. It was Brenda, Caroline's mousy subordinate. She was standing behind a tree, but the object in her hands was unmistakable, a camera with a telephoto lens. She wasn't being subtle. When she saw me looking, she flinched and ducked away, but it was too late. The occasional camera shutter clicks I'd faintly heard over the past few days now made sense. They weren't just harassing me, they were building a file, manufacturing a case against me out of thin air. The peace I had sought by moving here was gone, replaced by a feeling of being under siege. That my own home was no longer a sanctuary. The final escalation, the act that pushed me past. The point of endurance happened on a beautiful Sunday morning. The sky was clear, the air was crisp, and for the first time in weeks, I felt a sliver of peace. I was on my porch reading a book with Max dozing at my feet. Then I saw her. Caroline Vance emerged from her house dressed in a pink tracksuit that looked absurd on her wiry frame. She was carrying a black trash bag, but instead of walking toward her own garbage bins, she marched straight across the street. Her posture rigid and her face a mask of smug purpose. She came right to the edge of my driveway, where it met the public road, and casually dropped the bag right on the corner of my lawn. It landed with a wet thud. Then she turned, and just loud enough for me to hear, her voice dripping with contempt, she said, "Trashy people cheapen the whole community. Some people simply have no respect for standards." I set my book down, the blood in my veins turning to ice. It wasn't just trash. The putrid smell that wafted from it told me it was old kitchen garbage, possibly mixed with used cat litter. It was a deliberate violation, a calculated insult. I stood up, folded my arms across my chest, and just watched. I didn't say a word. Our eyes met for a moment. Seeing me staring, she seemed to falter slightly, and her pace quickened as she returned to her house. As she neared her door, I saw her give a subtle thumbs up, and then I saw Brenda. There she was again, tucked in a corner across the street. Lowering a camera, they had staged the whole thing. Caroline dumped trash on my property, and Brenda photographed it, creating evidence of my own meannesses. The sheer cunning of it stunned me. In that moment, all the annoyance, all the frustration vanished, replaced by a cold, clear resolve. This woman had crossed every line. She had turned my life into a circus, and I would no longer be a spectator. To her madness, I called Max inside, shut the door, and went straight to my desk. The defense was over. It was time to go on the offensive. She had made a fatal mistake. She had turned a neighbor who wanted to be left alone into a city planner, who was now prepared to dig up every inch of legal ground to bury her. Rage, however hot, eventually cools. What was left in me after cleaning up the putrid mess Caroline had left was a cold focus, a ruthless clarity. She had started a war, little knowing I'd spent my career mapping battlefields just like this one. That night, my dining room transformed into a command center. The only light in the room was the glow from my 27-inch laptop screen, illuminating the plat maps, property deeds, and legal documents I had printed and spread across the oak table. The air was thick with the smell of strong black coffee, and Max lay quietly at my feet, sensing the shift in my demeanor. This was no longer defense. This was a hunt. One of the perks of a long career in city planning is that you know exactly where the buried weapons are. I logged into the county's Geographic Information System, GIS, a powerful tool I once used daily. On the screen, the neighborhood appeared as a high-resolution satellite photograph. With a few clicks, I began layering data over it. Bright red property lines, color-coded zoning areas, blue utility easements. It was like peeling back the skin of a complex organism to reveal the skeleton beneath. I started with my property, then expanded to Caroline's Willow Creek Estates. And then I saw it. It wasn't a dramatic, earth-shattering discovery, but a subtle anomaly. A hairline crack in the facade. The official HOA boundary, as recorded by the county, was a crisp, bold red line. However, when I compared it to the internal map the HOA had posted on their website, I saw a discrepancy. Their boundary line had been stretched, creeping a full 100 feet eastward, just enough to envelop the public road and nearly swallow a third of my property. My heart didn't beat faster, but a slow, cold smile spread across my face. There it was. The first piece of irrefutable proof that they were operating on a lie. They had redrawn the map to suit their own world. After hours of staring at the screen, my head began to throb. I needed air. I took Max for an evening walk, the cool air helping to clear my thoughts. We walked down the disputed road, Max happily sniffing everything in his path. Suddenly, he was drawn by an interesting scent near the fence of a home toward the end of the block and began nosing his way into a lush bed of roses. This house, unlike the other sterilely manicured properties, had a vibrant, slightly wild garden. "Oh, careful with my prize winners, handsome." A gentle, slightly raspy voice called out. I turned to see an older woman rising from a patch of hydrangeas. She was in her early 70s with silver hair pulled back in a neat bun. She wore a simple dress, covered by a dirt-smudged gardening apron. Her eyes were crinkled at the corners from age, but they were sharp and kind. "I'm so sorry," I said, giving Max's leash a gentle tug. "He's just curious." She smiled, a warm, genuine expression. "It's quite all right. I'm Eleanor. You're the new fella." We fell into the usual neighborly small talk about dogs and gardens. But when I mentioned I was trying to revive a few rose bushes near my own fence line, Eleanor's smile faded. She cast a subtle, nervous glance toward Caroline's house, then lowered her voice. "Be careful with those. The Millers who lived there before you had roses there too. They didn't last long." There was a delicate warning in her tone. Then she looked me straight in the eye, her kind face now etched with concern. "You're the one Carolyn has been complaining about at the HOA meetings, aren't you?" The abrupt shift in her demeanor put me on alert. I nodded. Eleanor looked around again, as if the hedges had ears. "Do you have a few minutes? I think there are some things you should know. Please join me on my porch." Her porch was a quiet sanctuary of wicker chairs and hanging ferns. She brought out 2 glasses of iced tea, the cubes clinking in the silence. Once she was sure we were alone, Eleanor began, her voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't Caroline's first time. You aren't the first one." She told me about 3 families who had been forced to sell and leave within the last 5 years, all following long, brutal campaigns of harassment from Caroline. The Millers with their 2 young boys fined 4 children's noise. The Garcias, who loved to barbecue, accused of creating fire and odor hazards. "She's the HOA's smiling executioner," Eleanor said, and the phrase sent a chill down my spine. "She'll torture you with bylaws, suffocate you with paperwork, until you have no fight left, and you just ... leave." But then she revealed the detail. That made my blood run cold, the one that twisted the narrative from an abuse of power into a deliberate conspiracy. "But the strangest part is this," she said, leaning forward. "Whenever those families finally gave up and moved away, all the complaint files against them, they would just vanish from the HOA records, like they never existed at all." I sat up straight. "How do you know that, my husband?" she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "He used to be on the board before Carolyn took complete control. He tried to look up some of the older cases for reference during a meeting, but they were just gone, completely scrubbed. Meanwhile, every complaint Caroline had filed against them remained perfectly preserved." I sat there on Eleanor's porch, the iced tea forgotten, condensation dripping onto my hand. Everything had changed. I wasn't just dealing with a control-freak neighbor. I was dealing with a methodical predator, someone who knew how to manipulate the system and erase the evidence. The families before me hadn't just been driven away. They had been expunged from the community's history. And I knew, with absolute certainty, she was planning to do the same thing to me. The space on Eleanor's porch seemed to shrink. The last of the daylight had faded, giving way to encroaching shadows that stretched from tree trunks and the corners of the house. The evening chorus of crickets and cicadas began to rise from the garden, but it didn't sound peaceful. Instead, it sounded like a chorus of warnings. My glass of iced tea sat untouched, the ice long melted, leaving a small pool of condensation. On the coaster, Eleanor's hands, gnarled and liver-spotted from a lifetime of gardening, were gripping the arms of her wicker chair. "Vanished?" repeated, my voice low, trying to fit the pieces together. "HOA records don't just vanish, someone needs access. Admin privileges." The city planner in me was screaming. Records were sacred. Altering them was a cardinal sin. Eleanor swallowed hard, her eyes darting over my shoulder, toward the darkened street. "My husband, David, he thought so too," she said, her voice barely audible. He was the board's treasurer then. He was meticulous, a real stickler for details. He noticed something was off after the Garcia family left. The volume of archived paperwork just seemed ... light. She paused, taking a deep, shuddering breath, as if preparing to dive into cold, deep water. David did his own audit of the computer. Systems access logs. He found that at 2 a.m, 2 days after the Garcias moved out, a user with top-level administrative access, the president's access, had logged in and permanently deleted a series of files. The files were named after the Garcia's lot number. The air grew colder. "Did he confront Caroline?" I asked. Eleanor nodded, a slow, painful gesture. She didn't have to have been there. The horror of her husband's memory was etched into her. He met with her privately in the HOA office. He thought perhaps it was a mistake. David was a kind man. He always gave people the benefit of the doubt. He laid out what he'd found, the log printouts. He asked her why, and what did she say? "She didn't deny it," Eleanor whispered, and that was the most terrifying part. David said she just sat there, behind that big mahogany desk, her blonde hair perfectly still. She looked at him with those ice-blue eyes, and she smiled. A smile that didn't reach her eyes. She said, "David, you're so thorough. It's a fine quality." some circumstances, and then she pushed a file across the desk toward him. Eleanor closed her eyes. It was an old audit from 5 years prior. David had made a minor mistake. A small bookkeeping error where he'd added a column incorrectly and then immediately corrected it himself. No harm done, just a human error. But Carolyn had kept a copy. She told my husband that with a little creative framing, that small error could be made to look an awful lot like embezzlement. She said if that story were to get out, his reputation in this town, where he'd lived his whole life, would be ruined. She hinted how hard it might be for our son, who was looking for his first job out of college, to get a good start if his father was caught up in a financial scandal. The confession tumbled out of her, trembling and pained. It was a perfectly veiled threat. Blackmail. David was shattered, came home that night, his face white as a sheet. He resigned from the board the very next day, citing his health. Carolyn didn't just silence him, she broke him. He was never the same after that. And I stayed quiet. Stayed quiet because we were afraid. Tears began to trace paths down her wrinkled cheeks. I reached out and gently placed a hand on her trembling one. Eleanor, I said softly, you did nothing wrong. You and David were cornered. But in my mind, a cold rage was building. This was no longer about an abuse of power. This was calculated. Criminal behavior, tampering with records, extortion, intimidation. Caroline wasn't a petty tyrant. She was a suburban mob boss. I sat with Eleanor for a while longer until her composure returned. When I stood to leave, she looked up at me, her eyes wet but now holding a spark of resolve. Be careful, she said. She's so much more dangerous than you think. I walked down the dark street back to my house. The night air felt thick and menacing. The warm yellow lights in the neighbors' windows now looked like watchful eyes, hiding their own secrets and fears. Every rustle of leaves in the wind made me jump. Eleanor had given me an invaluable gift, the truth. But she had also placed a great weight on my shoulders. I was no longer just fighting for my house. I was fighting for David, for the Millers and the Garcias, for Eleanor. When I stepped inside, Max greeted me, but I only gave him an absent-minded pat. I went straight to my command center at the dining table. The digital proof of the boundary line was a start, but it wasn't enough. Eleanor's story, as much as I believed it, was hearsay. To take down someone like Carolyn, I needed something undeniable, something in ink, something that predated her reign of terror. I needed the original maps, the first subdivision plans filed. When this neighborhood was born, the game had changed. This wasn't about fences and noise anymore. This was about taking down an empire built on fear and fraud. And I knew exactly where I needed to be in the morning. The county registrar's office. Archives dawn arrived with a cold clarity. Last night was not a dream. Eleanor's trembling confession, the story of blackmail and expunged records, still echoed in my mind. The rage was gone. In its place was the heavy weight of responsibility. Before the sun was fully up, I was in my old pickup truck, driving toward the city center. My destination, the county courthouse, a formidable, grand old building of gray granite. But I wasn't there for a trial. I was going to its memory bank, the registrar's office archives. The archives were in the basement, a world away from the bureaucratic hustle on the floors above. The air was thick with the scent of time itself, of old paper, bookbinding glue, and decades of settled dust. Long, fluorescent bulbs hummed overhead, casting a weak, greenish light on towering metal shelves that stretched back into the gloom. The silence was almost liturgical, broken only by the hum of the ventilation and the occasional rustle of paper. This was where the county's history was logged, not in grand stories, but in lot numbers, faded signatures, and cracked wax seals. The only other person in the cavernous room was a desk clerk named George, a middle-aged man with thinning hair, and a permanent look of boredom, as if he'd seen it all and been impressed by none of it. He barely glanced up from his newspaper as I approached. "Help you?" he asked, his voice a monotone drone. Instead of being vague, I fell back on my old professional methodology. "Good morning. I need to see the original filings for the Willow Creek Estates subdivision, circa 1973. Specifically, the master plat map, the deed covenants, and restrictions. utility easement records, and the original road maintenance agreements. The specificity of my request seemed to spark a flicker of interest in George. He lowered his paper. 1973? You're digging deep. This way. He led me to a far corner of the archives, where massive leather-bound ledgers were stored on the shelves. He gestured to a section. Willow Creek is in there somewhere. Knock yourself out. For the next 2 hours, I lost myself in the past. I carefully turned the brittle, yellowed pages, feeling the weight of history in my hands. I found the utility agreements, the deed restrictions with their archaic clauses about not raising poultry. But what I truly needed was the master plat, MAP's ultimate legal document defining the HOA's boundaries. Finally, I found it. A huge ledger labeled WC73 plats. My heart beat a little faster. I gently heaved it onto a dusty reading table and opened it. The first few pages were technical notes and signatures from surveyors and county officials. The ink had faded to a blue-gray, but it was all legible. Turned the pages, searching for the main map, page 3, as designated in the table of contents. Page 1, page 2. And then, something was wrong. Instead of page 3, I was looking at page 4. I flipped back. No, I hadn't made a mistake. Page 3 was gone, but it hadn't just fallen out. I looked closer at the binding, where page 3 should have been. There was only a small, jagged stub of paper, or a clean slice. It had been carefully, deliberately excised with a sharp blade. A column of ice traced its way down my spine despite the stuffiness of the basement. The feeling was worse than disappointment. It was confirmation of my deepest fears. The conspiracy wasn't just digital. Someone had come here to this public archive and had destroyed a government record. "Hey, George," I called out, my voice hoarse. "We have a problem here." Stoltered over, still looking half asleep. "What's up?" I pointed to the book's spine. "It's the most important page of this file. It's been cut out." George squinted, then pulled a pair of reading glasses from his shirt pocket. He looked at the slice, and for the first time, the boredom on his face vanished, replaced by astonishment. "I'll be damned," he muttered. "Worked here 15 years. Never seen that. Someone took a razor to it." "Is there a log of who's viewed these files?" I asked, my voice urgent. George sighed, shaking his head. "Yeah, paper logs. We got dozens of them going back to the 70s. It'd take weeks to go through them, and there's no guarantee the perp signed their real name." Desperation began to creep in. Carolyn, or one of her minions, had been one step ahead of me. She hadn't just erased her digital tracks. She'd erased the paper ones, too. She had anticipated someone would one day come looking for the truth, and she had cut it out at its very root. I stood there amidst the silent shelves, feeling like a fool. I had brought my professional expertise to a gunfight, only to find my opponent had already burned down the armory. I left the basement, blinking in the harsh light of the hallway. The taste of failure was like ash in my mouth. But as I stood there, leaning against the cold marble wall, a new thought began to crystallize. This act of destruction, while a major setback, was also evidence. It was an act of desperation, and it was a felony. Tampering with public records was a serious federal crime. The problem was, I couldn't prove it alone. My solo investigation was over. I needed someone who could turn this vandalism into a legal weapon. I pulled out my phone, scrolling through my contacts until I found the name Arthur Finch. Arthur was a lawyer I'd worked with years ago on a thorny zoning dispute. He wasn't the kind of lawyer who advertised on television. He was old, dressed, a bit shabbily, and his office was a chaotic mess. But his mind was sharp as a tack, and once he took a case, he latched on like a bulldog. I dialed the number. A polite female voice answered. "Finch Law Office." My voice was low and urgent. "Name is Alex. I need to speak with Mr. Finch. It's an urgent matter regarding the tampering of public records and HOA fraud." There was a pause on the other end. I could hear typing. "Can you be here at 3 this afternoon, Mr. Alex?" she asked, her tone now shifted more serious. "Mr. Finch will make time for you." I hung up, feeling the first spark of hope I'd had. All day, Caroline wasn't just redrawing maps. She was trying to erase history. And in doing so, she just handed me a new weapon. Proof of a crime. The fight was no longer in the shadows. Soon, it would be in the full light of the law. At 3 p.m., I walked into the Finch Law Office. It was nothing like the sleek marble-floored firms one sees on TV. It was on the second floor of an old brick building. And the space inside was a masterclass in organized chaos. Towering stacks of law books grew from the floor like paper stalagmites. Thick case files overflowed from every shelf, and the air was rich with the smell of strong coffee. Old paper and the faint, ghostly scent of pipe tobacco from years long. Past, in the midst of it all, behind a massive oak desk, nearly obscured by documents, sat Arthur Finch. He was in his late 60s, stout, and wore a rumpled tweed jacket that seemed to be his uniform. His shock of unruly white hair was a rebellious halo, and behind thick glasses, his blue eyes were startlingly sharp and intelligent. He was engrossed in a document, but he looked up as I entered, and those eyes seemed to take in my entire story in a single glance. "Mr. Alex," he said, his voice a powerful rasp. "Sit down. You look like you've seen a ghost." I sank into the cracked leather chair opposite him, and for the next half hour, I laid out the entire story. I presented it methodically, chronologically, the way I would present a zoning report, from the first email about the door color to the ridiculous phone calls, Brenda's surveillance campaign, and the climactic stage trash dumping. I told him about the conversation with Eleanor, her confession about her husband and the blackmail. Finally, I described my trip to the archives that morning and the sickening discovery of the excised map page. Arthur listened without interruption, giving only the occasional grunt, his sharp eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair, which groaned in protest. "Well," he said slowly, "this Caroline Vance isn't just a bully. She's an artist of harassment and intimidation." He picked up a pen and began scratching on a yellow legal pad. Her threatening Eleanor's husband with a trumped-up embezzlement charge? That's extortion, plain and simple. Her having someone destroy a public record? That's not just stupid. That's the kind of arrogance that comes from believing you're above the law. He peered at me over his glasses. "And you're right, the missing map page is both a disaster and a gift. It shows criminal intent. Any judge will see that. The problem is, it's damn hard to win a boundary case without the primary exhibit. We need a copy of that page." My hope sank. I figured as much. But how? The original surveying company went out of business in the 90s. Arthur nodded, chewing on the end of his pen. "Right. I had my paralegal check as soon as you called. Thompson engaged surveyors. They're defunct. Worse, their records archive burned down in a warehouse fire in '98. A complete dead end." The room seemed to dim. Caroline had covered her tracks perfectly. She hadn't just cut out a page. She had used the ravages of time and misfortune to obliterate every copy. Felt a wave of the despair I'd been fighting off since the morning. Stared at the county zoning map I'd brought with me, spread across Arthur's desk. My mind was racing, searching for a way out, a flaw in her logic. I put myself back in the shoes of a city planner in 1973, approving a new subdivision. What was the process? What were the steps? The developers submit the map. The city reviews. Then ... before a single brick is laid, before a single road is paved, there's an essential step. Involving permanent infrastructure. And then it hit me. A flash of light in the frustrating gloom. "The utility companies," I said, almost to myself. Arthur stopped chewing his pen and looked at me. "Go on, son." "The utility companies," I repeated, my voice stronger now, more confident. "The electric company, the water authority, the gas company. They can't start installing infrastructure power lines, water mains based on a draft. They need a certified copy of the final, legally approved plat map to record their permanent easements. Their records are operational, not historical. They are independently archived. They have to be accurate or the whole system falls apart." Arthur was motionless for a second. Then a slow, wolfish grin, the first I'd seen, spread across his face. He slammed a hand on his desk, making the paper towers tremble. By God, son, you've got it. She can shred the public records, burn the surveyor's archives, but she can't touch the internal engineering archives of a public utility. That afternoon, we were in the records room of the county electric company. It was a world away from the dusty courthouse basement. It was clean, cold, and clinically organized, with rows of metal flat file cabinets. An older engineer who had worked there for 40 years helped us in our search, and there, in a drawer labeled Willow Creek 1973, grid installation, we found it. It wasn't just a copy. It was an original drafting on vellum, perfectly preserved, and stapled carefully to the inside cover of the folder was our holy grail, a crisp, certified copy of the missing page 3. It was all there, slightly faded India ink. The clear boundary line of the HOA ending well short of my property. And, most importantly, a typed legal notation at the bottom of the page that read, "This road is hereby designated a permanent public easement for the benefit of all surrounding properties, present and future." It was the smoking gun. But there was more. As I held the map up to the fluorescent light to inspect it, I noticed something else in the margin, a handwritten note in fountain pen. From the original city planner in 1973, his cursive was sharp and decisive. The note read, "Developer Vance Sr. attempted to submit revised plat with altered boundary post-approval. Rejected, reminded developer that public easement is a non-negotiable condition of zoning permit." Arthur and I stood there in the silence of the cold archive room. I felt a jolt of electricity. This wasn't just a smoking gun. This was the history of the whole ammunition belt. It didn't just prove the HOA boundary was a fraud. It proved that Caroline's father, the original developer, had tried to pull the exact same scam 50 years ago and had failed. Caroline wasn't just obsessed with rules. She was carrying on a family legacy of fraud, trying to reclaim land her family felt they were cheated out of, land they had tried to steal. Her claim of ancestral birthright wasn't a delusion. It was chapter 2 of a crime novel. Arthur clapped me on the back, a solid, heavy thud. He looked at the handwritten note, then at me, a fierce light in his blue eyes. "Well, Alex," he said, his voice low with grim satisfaction, "it seems we're not just suing an HOA president. We're going to expose a family tradition." The days following, the seismic discovery at the electric company passed in a strange sort of quiet. It was not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of a storm gathering energy just offshore. Arthur and I worked tirelessly. The precious map, with its damning handwritten note from a long-dead planner, was copied, notarized, and secured in the vault in Arthur's office. We were meticulously building our countersuit. A legal missile aimed not just at dismissing Caroline's case, but at exposing her entire fraudulent empire. Knowing the truth had given me a strange sense of calm. I no longer felt hunted. I felt like a hunter, patiently sharpening his spear. I even returned to renovating my house, the sound of the hammer and saw becoming a form of therapy. Each nail driven home a reaffirmation of my rightful ownership, and then it arrived. On a bright Tuesday morning, a certified mail truck pulled up. Not my usual mail carrier, but a formal courier, handed me a large, thick envelope made of expensive, cream-colored paper. In the top left corner, an elegant, embossed logo, Sterling. Westbrook & Associates, one of the most expensive and ruthless corporate law firms in the state. I signed for it, feeling its weight in my hand. I placed the envelope on my kitchen table, poured myself a coffee, and only then did I sit down. Max, sensing the tension, came and rested his head on my leg. I tore open the thick paper, revealing a neatly stapled sheaf of documents. The language within was cold, clinical, and calculated to crush the spirit of the reader. It was a formal lawsuit. The Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association was suing me, Alex, for a long list of grievances. They were demanding $50,000 in damages for diminishing community harmony and property values. They sought a permanent injunction against my use of the road. I demanded I pay to have my ancient oak tree, which they termed a persistent hazard, removed. But the ultimate insult was on the final page. It was an Exhibit A, a pre-written letter of apology. In it, I was to admit to my disruptive and uncooperative behavior, praise the wise governance of the HOA board, and pledge future compliance. I was to sign it and agree to have it published on the front page of the community newsletter. I read that paragraph again, and then I laughed. Not a laugh of mirth, but a cold, dry, humorless sound. The arrogance, the sheer, blinding confidence of it all was breathtaking. They were playing chess, completely unaware that their board was about to be flipped over, as if on cue. Just as I was staring at the ludicrous apology letter, I heard the crunch of tires on my gravel driveway. I looked out the window. A gleaming black sedan had pulled up, and from it emerged 3 figures. Leading the charge was Carolyn Vance, looking every bit the conquering general. She wore a severe, perfectly tailored navy blue suit, her blonde hair unmoving, her face a mask of cold triumph. Right behind her was Brenda, clutching an even thicker file, the camera around her neck like a badge of deputized authority. And a third person, a man I hadn't seen before. He was young, my age perhaps, in a slick, expensive suit. With perfectly gelled hair and a smug smirk that seemed glued to his face, he radiated an aura of expensive ruthlessness. This had to be Westbrook. I didn't wait for them to knock. I opened the door and stepped out onto my porch just as they started up the walk, standing with my arms crossed, blocking my own entrance. It was a small thing, but it changed the dynamic. They wanted to invade my space. Instead, I forced them to meet me on neutral ground. "Good morning, Caroline," I said, my voice perfectly calm. "Mr. Alex," she replied, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I trust you've just received some paperwork. We're here as a final courtesy to discuss an amicable resolution." The young lawyer Westbrook stepped forward, extending a hand. I didn't take it. His smirk didn't falter. "Westbrook," he said, "I represent the association. Look, Alex, we don't want this to get ugly. Lawsuits like this are expensive, time-consuming, and unpleasant for everyone. My client is prepared to be extremely generous." As he spoke, I heard the rhythmic click of a camera shutter. Brenda was documenting the scene, capturing their reasonableness and my intransigence. Westbrook continued, his tone as smooth as silk. "Here is our offer. My client will graciously reduce the damages to $25,000. In exchange, you will immediately surrender your right to use the road. Build yourself a new access drive-e. Believe there's an alternative route around the marsh in the back end. Of course, sign the letter of apology. It's a fantastic deal. It goes away. Everyone can be good neighbors again." He said it as if he were bestowing a great gift, as if building a road through a swamp was a minor inconvenience.
Oh.
His condescension was nearly incandescent, but I kept my face a cool mask. I looked past him, past Brenda, and directly into Caroline's eyes. I wanted her to see that her pawns didn't intimidate me. "I've received your documents," I said, my tone still even and measured. "They're quite comprehensive. I'll need some time for my attorney to review them thoroughly." I put an emphasis on the words "my attorney," and I saw something shift. Caroline's triumphant smile faltered slightly, replaced by a flicker of annoyance. She had been expecting a frightened, capitulating homeowner, not someone already lawyered up. Westbrook's smug facade paused for a beat. He was used to dealing with people who were scared. "Your attorney?" Westbrook repeated, trying to regain the offensive. "Look, pal, don't make the mistake of thinking some local lawyer can go up against our resources. This offer is on the table for 48 hours. After that, we proceed with the full force of the law. Discovery, depositions, motions, ... It will bury you in paper and costs." I just nodded slowly. "I heard you. All future communications can go through my legal counsel. Now, if you'll excuse me, I have work to do." I stood my ground, unmoving, making my silence a wall. After a tense moment, the trio had no choice but to turn back. As they walked away, I saw them huddled together near their car. A brief whispered strategy session. Caroline was gesticulating angrily. Westbrook was nodding, his expression thoughtful. Brenda showed them something on her camera's display. They were a pack, confident they had just cornered their prey, utterly oblivious that the prey was a hunter standing at the entrance to a bear's cave. I stood on the porch, watching them drive off until the car disappeared around a bend.
Ow.
I looked down at the papers in my hand. They seemed so flimsy, so meaningless compared to the heavy vellum map locked securely in Arthur's office. I went inside, closed the door, and called him immediately. I recounted the entire visit and their offer. On the other end of the line, I didn't hear concern. Instead, I heard a low, throaty chuckle. "Good, good," Arthur rasped, his voice alight with glee. "They're arrogant, unbelievably overconfident. They've walked right into the trap we're setting." "So what's the next move?" I asked. "The next move?" Arthur said, and I could picture his wolfish grin. "We don't just respond. We file our countersuit immediately. We'll ask for an emergency injunction to stop their harassment, and we will serve them with a summons of their own. It's time to let them know they're not fighting a homeowner anymore. They're fighting history." My call to Arthur was like lighting the fuse on a time bomb. The very next day, Arthur didn't just respond to Caroline's lawsuit. He launched an all-out legal blitzkrieg. The countersuit we filed was not a defensive document. It was a weapon of attack. It was over 40 pages long, meticulously drafted, every word chosen for maximum impact. We didn't just ask for their baseless suit to be dismissed. We demanded $100,000 in damages for targeted harassment, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and slander. We demanded a full, quartered forensic audit of the HOA's entire financial history for the past 5 years, to investigate the potential misappropriation of community funds for personal vendettas. And then we dropped the atom bomb. We challenged the HOA's fundamental legal authority over the entire eastern section of the neighborhood, the area their fraudulent map laid claim to. We argued that, based on the irrefutable evidence, dozens of families may have been paying dues and fines illegally for years. We were, in essence, threatening to collapse their entire power structure. As Arthur told me over the phone, his voice filled with a cruel glee, "We're not just poking the bear, Alex. We're suing the cave and claiming it was built on an illegal foundation." A court process server delivered our petition to Caroline on her marble-inlaid doorstep on a Thursday afternoon. I can only imagine the scene, her smug expression turning to disbelief, then to pure incandescent rage as she read page after page, realizing her prey was not only fighting back, but was aiming for the heart of her empire. The first shot had been fired, and it was a cannonball. But Caroline Vance was not one to be outmaneuvered on a single front. When she couldn't attack with facts, she attacked with fiction. A week later, the Willow Creek Estates monthly newsletter came out. It was printed on glossy paper, featuring pictures of perfect tulip beds and reminders of the upcoming community bake sale. But nestled on page 2 was a news section under a bold red headline, "Community Alert." It never mentioned me by name, but it didn't have to. In a tone that was equal parts sorrowful and indignant, the article spoke of a new litigious individual on the neighborhood's periphery who had refused all friendly attempts at cooperation. It wrote that this person was seeking to exploit minor clerical loopholes to tear down the harmony and standards we have all worked so hard to build. It painted our countersuit as a frivolous and malicious attack designed to drain the community's treasury funds that were for playground maintenance and children's events. It was a masterpiece of propaganda, turning me into a selfish villain trying to ruin everyone's way of life for the sake of not following a few simple rules. And it worked. The atmosphere in town changed almost overnight. The whisper started to follow me. At the coffee shop, the barista, who always smiled now, gave me a clipped cold nod. At the hardware store, neighbors I used to chat with about garden projects suddenly became intensely interested in assortments of screws when I walked down the aisle. Isolation is a potent psychological weapon, and Caroline was wielding it like a master. The most direct confrontation happened on a Saturday morning. I was loading lumber into my truck when a neighbor, a retiree named Mr. Henderson with a beer gut and an immense pride in his lawn, marched right up to me. "You," he said, his voice unfriendly. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I paused, setting down a piece of wood.
Good morning, Mr. Henderson.
"Don't you good morning me?" he snarled. "I read the newsletter. You're suing the whole neighborhood. Do you have any idea what that's going to do to our HOA fees? We're paying for lawyers to deal with your nonsense. All because you're too special to follow a few simple rules," tried to explain. "Mr. Henderson, it's more complicated than that. My property isn't in the HOA. They have no jurisdiction," but he waved a dismissive hand. "That's what you say. Caroline says different, and she's been here 20 years. She keeps this place nice. You're just a troublemaker." He turned and stomped away, leaving me standing there in the silence, the weight of the community's ostracism pressing down on me. The days that followed were hard. The loneliness was corrosive. Once my sanctuary now felt like a besieged fortress. Max was my only non-judgmental companion. There were nights I'd sit in my dining room turned command center, staring at the maps and documents, and wonder if it was worth it. Maybe I should just sell and move. Maybe peace was more important than being right. Caroline wasn't just attacking me, legally. She was trying to break my will, to make me feel so utterly alone that I would give up on my own. It was starting to work. The shift came from an unexpected place. On a dreary afternoon, as I was walking Max on a little-used trail behind my house, I saw Eleanor waiting. She was holding something wrapped in a kitchen towel. "I thought you might need this," she said softly, handing me a still warm loaf of banana bread. The simple gesture in the face of my isolation was so profound it almost brought me to tears. She looked around, making sure no one could hear. "Don't let them break you, Alex. This is what she does. She makes you a pariah. She makes you feel like you're the only person in the world who thinks you're right. It's how she won before." She paused, looking at me with an urgency in her eyes. "But it's different this time. People are scared, but they're also watching. A few have quietly asked me about the lawsuit. They're starting to wonder." Her words, and the warmth of the bread in my hands, were an antidote to the poison of solitude. She reminded me that I wasn't just fighting for myself. I was fighting for her husband David, and for the others who were too afraid to speak up. This fight wasn't about a road or a tree. It was about breaking a reign of fear. In that moment, my doubt evaporated, replaced by a harder, colder steel in my spine. I would not break. I would not leave. I returned home with a renewed sense of purpose. That evening I was at Arthur's office, that chaotic space now our war room. We fortified our entire case, turning it into an impregnable legal fortress. We didn't just rely on the map. We prepared sworn affidavits from land surveying experts who confirmed our interpretation of the documents. We drafted scathing deposition questions for Carol and Brenda and the slick lawyer Westbrook. Arthur had large presentation boards made, blowing up the utility company map and the old planner's note, turning the complex legal documents into a simple, visual story of fraud and deceit. "We don't just present evidence, Alex," Arthur said, pacing in front of the boards. "We tell a story. By the time we're done, the judge won't see Caroline Vance as a dedicated HOA president. He'll see her as the villain in a crime novel she wrote. Herself." Late that week, as we bound all the documents into a half-dozen thick, perfectly labeled and organized binders, I felt a sense of readiness. The pile of paper was no longer a burden. "This isn't paperwork," Arthur said, slapping one of the binders. "This is armor." And then, on Monday morning, we got the notice. The first preliminary hearing had been scheduled. The date of the battle was set. The armor was forged, the weapons were sharp. All that was left was to walk into the arena. The county courthouse hearing room was not some grand hall of justice from the movies. It was a small, somewhat stuffy room, paneled in dark oak, that was faded with age. The morning light streamed through tall windows, illuminating motes of dust, dancing in the still, tense air. But the smallness of the room only amplified the drama, because it was packed. The entire neighborhood, it seemed, had turned out. I saw Mr. Henderson in a back row, his face a scowl. I saw the neighbors who had shunned me, now sitting with expressions of nervous curiosity, and in a far corner, I saw Eleanor. She sat alone, her hands clasped in her lap, and she gave me a small nod. A quiet show of support that was as powerful as a lighthouse in the fog. Then they entered. Caroline, Westbrook, and Brenda, a trinity of arrogance. Caroline was in a power red dress, her brooch glittering defiantly under the lights. She walked with the confidence of a queen about to witness a public execution. Westbrook, the lawyer, was dapper in a charcoal suit, his hair perfect, his smug smile somehow even wider. But it was Brenda who surprised me most. Not only was she clutching her file, but she was busy setting up a professional video camera on a tripod in the corner of the room. Arthur, in his customary rumpled tweed, leaned toward me. "Pure theater," he whispered. "She thinks she's going to win. She wants to record your humiliation and broadcast it on the community access channel. Pure psychological warfare." I swallowed hard, feeling my heart hammer against my ribs. Her audacity was limitless. When Judge Patterson, a man with a stern face and a mane of silver hair, entered, the room fell silent. The hearing began. As they were the plaintiffs, Westbrook went first. He was a master performer. He paced before the judge's bench, his voice rising and falling, painting a picture of an idyllic, orderly community where people lived in harmony. Until I arrived, he portrayed me as an uncooperative outsider, a troublemaker who refused to abide by the reasonable standards. Everyone else happily accepted. He began presenting exhibits, Brenda's photos blown up on a screen, my lawn with a few blades of grass longer than regulation, my rusted mailbox, my oak tree, and then their ace in the hole, a series of close-up shots of the bag of trash Caroline had planted on my lawn, presented as irrefutable proof of my slovenly and disrespectful nature. "Your Honor," Westbrook said with a dramatic flourish, "this is not just about aesthetics. This is about respect. It's about one individual who believes he is above the community." Caroline sat there, nodding sadly, the benevolent leader wounded by her unruly subject. I could feel the eyes of the room on me, judging. I balled my hands into fists under the table, my nails digging into my palms. Arthur put a calming hand on my arm. "Let him have his stage," he murmured. "The bigger the stage, the harder the fall." Finally, Westbrook's performance concluded. "The defense," the judge said, looking at us. "Your response?" Arthur Finch rose. He moved slowly, deliberately. His somewhat disheveled appearance was a stark contrast to the sharpness in his eyes.
"Your Honor,"
he began, his voice not loud, but it filled the room, commanding attention. "We have a great deal to respond to. But before we discuss falling leaves or a dog's sneeze, I believe we need to address a slightly more fundamental issue. The issue of jurisdiction." On his cue, an assistant rolled out our first presentation board. On it was a large color printout of the map from the HOA's own website. "This, Your Honor, is the reality in which the plaintiff operates. A map of their own creation." Then he rolled out a second board, displaying the official map from the county registrar's office. "And this, Your Honor, is reality according to the laws of this county." A murmur rippled through the courtroom. The difference wasn't subtle. It was glaring. Dozens of homes, including Mr. Henderson's, were inside the HOA's map, but outside the legal one. As you can see, there's a significant discrepancy, Arthur continued. But even the county map doesn't tell the whole story, because this story didn't start a few months ago. It started 50 years ago, and then he went in for the kill. The third board was rolled out, and it drew a collective gasp from the room. It was a massive, high-resolution photograph of the vellum map from the utility company. It was huge, detailed, and undeniable. Arthur picked up a laser pointer, and a small red dot danced across its surface. "This is the true legal boundary line, signed and sealed in 1973, said. The dot, tracing a clear line, dozens of yards short of my property. And this, he moved the dot to the text at the bottom, is a sentence the plaintiff seems to have forgotten: permanent public easement for the benefit of all surrounding properties, present and future. That road never belonged to them. It's have no authority to control it." The room exploded in whispers. Judge Patterson had to bang his gavel for order. The color on Caroline's face had gone from power red to a pasty, horrified white. Westbrook was shuffling his papers frantically, beads of sweat on his forehead. He had been completely blindsided. But that is not the most interesting part of this story, Your Honor, Arthur said, his voice now like steel. He moved the laser dot to the handwritten note in the margin. He read every word aloud. Developer Vance Sr. attempted to submit. Revised plat with altered boundary post approval. Rejected ... Single quotes, a collective gasp went through the room. Arthur lowered the pointer and looked directly at Caroline. Your Honor, this is not a clerical misunderstanding. This is Chapter 2 of a half-century-long fraud. Mrs. Vance's father attempted to illegally seize this road in 1973 and was denied by the city planners. And now his daughter, Mrs. Caroline Vance, is using HOA funds to continue her family's fraudulent endeavor, harassing and extorting innocent residents to try and get what her father could not. It was a nuke. The accusation wasn't just of overreach. It was of a systematic, generational conspiracy. Objection? Westbrook yelled, leaping to his feet. This is speculation. It's baseless. Baseless. Arthur scoffed. Then perhaps you can explain why page 3 of the official ledger in the county archives was cut out with a razor blade. Or perhaps your client can explain blackmailing the former HOA treasurer, a Mr. David, into silence after she was caught deleting digital records. Caroline couldn't take it anymore. Her calculated composure shattered into a million pieces. Lies, she shrieked, jumping to her feet, her finger trembling as she pointed at me. It's all lies. He's made it all up. He's a serpent come to poison our community. Mrs. Vance, sit down. Judge Patterson roared, his voice thundering. But Caroline was lost, babbling, her face a blotchy red. Your Honor, Arthur said calmly in the chaos. We have subpoenaed the county registrar. The judge nodded, and a woman was called to the stand. She calmly testified that the utility company map was indeed an accurate copy of the missing original record. Yes. And that, yes, the ledger book in her office had been maliciously vandalized. All the color drained from Caroline's face. Into her chair, silent? Brenda's camera had stopped rolling. The entire room was holding its breath. Judge Patterson looked down from his bench, but he wasn't looking at me or Arthur. He was looking directly at Caroline, and his expression was no longer that of a man arbitrating a civil dispute. It was the face of a man looking at a crime. This court will take a 1-hour recess, he said, his voice cold. For me to review this extraordinary evidence. He picked up our packet. And when we return, I suspect we will have much more to discuss than just property lines. He banged his gavel, the sound like a final damning gunshot, and swept out. Of the room, the hour in the courtroom stretched for an eternity. The room, which had been tensely silent before the recess, was now utterly still, a heavy, expectant quiet. Caroline Vance sat motionless in her chair, her pale face a blank mask. The arrogance was completely gone, leaving an empty shell. Westbrook sat beside her, but with a small space between them. His briefcase already neatly packed, as if ready for a quick getaway. Brenda and her camera had vanished. In the back, an entire neighborhood held its breath. When Judge Patterson returned, he didn't sit immediately. He stood, surveying the room, his gaze resting for a moment on Caroline, then on me, and finally on the townspeople in the hard wooden pews. I have reviewed the evidence presented, he said, his voice echoing in the silence. And I find that this is a matter that goes far beyond a simple dispute of Homeowners Association bylaws. He sat and began to read his ruling, each word a hammer. Blow on the coffin of the empire Caroline had built. First, the HOA's lawsuit against me was dismissed with extreme prejudice, a legal term meaning it was dead, buried, and could never be filed again. A collective sigh of relief rippled through the room. Next, he turned to our countersuit, found in our favor on all counts, ordered the HOA to pay me the full $100,000 in damages for harassment, emotional distress, and slander. He ordered them to pay my entire legal bill down to the last cent. But that wasn't the killing blow. Furthermore, Judge Patterson said, looking directly at Caroline, this court issues a permanent injunction, declaring that the Willow Creek Estates Homeowners Association has no, and has never had, any legal jurisdiction over the public roadway in question or any of the properties that fall outside the legally recorded boundaries of the 1973 County Plat, CUDA, all fees, fines, or liens ever levied against these properties based on the fraudulent boundary are hereby rendered null and void, effective immediately. That was the moment the dam broke. Half the courtroom, the residents of the eastern section, erupted. There were stifled cheers, gasps of disbelief. Mr. Henderson, the man who had accosted me, sat with his mouth agape as the realization dawned that he'd been paying dues to a club he wasn't even a member of for years. And then Judge Patterson delivered the final, crushing hammer blow that ground Caroline to dust. Due to the serious nature of the allegations brought to light today, including fraud, the tampering of public records, and potential extortion, he said, his voice ice cold, this court is referring the entire record of this case to the district attorney's office for a full criminal investigation into Mrs. Caroline Vance and any other board members who may have been complicit. It was over. There was no escape. Caroline didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just sat there and crumpled, a woman consumed by her own power. When we walked out of the courthouse, we stepped into a changed world. The sun seemed brighter. The neighbors, who had shunned me, now approached, surrounding me. They didn't just shake my hand. They clapped me on the back. They hugged me. Mr. Henderson made his way through the small crowd, his face flushed with shame. "Mr. Alex," he mumbled, unable to meet my eyes. I'm sorry. I didn't know." "It's all right, Mr. Henderson," I said. "We all know now." Eleanor came to my side, her eyes wet with tears, and embraced me. "You did it," she whispered. "You set us all free." The collapse was swift and total. Within 24 hours, the HOA website was offline. Arthur received emails from 3 other board members, all resigning in unison, trying to jump from the sinking ship before the criminal investigators started naming names. A week later, a class action lawsuit was filed by the residents of the liberated zone, seeking to reclaim hundreds of thousands of dollars in illegally collected fees. 6 months later, facing pending criminal charges and crushing legal debt, Caroline Vance sold her house. The grand home on the corner, once her fortress of power, was sold for a loss to cover her expenses. She left in the night, vanishing from the town she had once ruled with an iron fist and a velvet glove. The queen was in exile. A year later, the neighborhood was a different place. The air was no longer thick with scrutiny and fear. Children played on the road that was now officially everyone's. People planted the flowers they wanted, painted their doors the colors they liked. Caroline's old house now belonged to a young couple with 2 small children. They had torn out her obsessively manicured lawn and replaced it, a vegetable garden and a swing set. My life had finally found the peace I'd craved. My house was finished, the porch no longer creaked, and my rose bushes were thriving. Made friends with my new neighbors, and every so often, Eleanor and David, who looked 10 years younger, would come over for dinner. We had one. The war was over, or so I thought. On a warm summer evening, I was hosting a small barbecue in my backyard. Eleanor, David, and a few other neighbors were there. Laughter and soft music filled the air. The new owner of Caroline's old house, a friendly man named Mark Davies, wandered over to the fence. "Hey, Alex," he said with a smile. "Smells great. Your garden is looking fantastic." We made small talk for a moment about fertilizer and garden pests. He seemed like a good guy. But as he turned to leave, he paused and said something, his tone casual, but the words sent a chill down my spine. "You know, it's funny about old properties," he said, his eyes scanning the boundary between our yards. "So much history buried under the soil. The Vances. They were very attached to this land, believed it held a certain promise for their family." His smile was friendly, but there was something in his eyes I couldn't read. He gave a nod and went back to his house. I stood there, a feeling of unease creeping into my perfect evening. A promise? Buried history? Later, after my guests had left, I was cleaning up under the porch light when I saw something glinting in the flower bed near the fence, right where Mark Davies had been standing. Curious, I went over and knelt. I brushed away the soft mulch with My heart stopped. It was a metal surveyor's stake. Old and almost completely rusted through, driven deep into the earth. It bore no county markings. It looked ancient. And it was on my side of the fence. It was on my land by about 3 feet. It suggested an older claim. A line drawn long before the maps of 1973. I stood there in the summer dark, staring at that silent piece of metal. The legal battle was over. Caroline was gone. But as I looked at that buried relic, I was struck by a disturbing truth. I may have won the war against a woman, but the story of this land, the fight for the birthright she was so obsessed with, might have roots far deeper, far older, and far more dangerous than I had ever imagined.